The air in McGrath's saloon tasted like old tobacco and older sins. Lydia Mercer stood on the makeshift platform, really just 3 crates stacked together, and tried to remember how to breathe. Her hands were bound in front of her, not with rope, but with the kind of debt that wrapped around your throat and squeezed until you stopped asking questions. Around her, faces she'd known her whole life refused to meet her eyes. Mrs. Patterson from the general store. Tommy Reeves, who used to bring flowers to her mother's grave. Even Sheriff Dalton, whose star caught the lamplight like a tiny, useless sun. None of them would help. Fear had that effect. It turned good people into furniture. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, his voice cutting through the whiskey-thick atmosphere. His name was Silas Crane, and he'd presided over livestock sales for 20 years. This was his first time selling a person, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. "We gather here to settle the outstanding debts of the late Jonathan Mercer, surveyor and landowner, whose untimely passing 3 weeks ago left considerable obligations unfulfilled." Untimely passing. The words stuck in Lydia's throat like fish bones. Her father hadn't passed. He'd been found at the bottom of Copper Ridge with his neck broken and his surveying equipment smashed beyond recognition. The sheriff called it an accident. Lydia called it murder. But accusations required proof, and proof required power, and she had neither. "The debt stands at $4,200, Crane continued, consulting a ledger that had appeared exactly 1 day after the funeral. Lydia had never seen that ledger before. Her father kept meticulous records. She'd gone through every paper in their small house, every receipt and contract. Nothing came close to that amount. But Barrett Crow said otherwise. And in Red Hollow, what Barrett Crow said became truth. He stood near the bar now, one boot on the brass rail, watching her the way men watch horses they plan to break. Barrett Crow was 43 years old, built like a bull, and owned everything that mattered within 50 miles. Cattle, land, the bank, the sheriff. He wore his power in his tailored vest and the gold watch chain that caught lamplight like a promise of violence. "She's a pretty thing," someone muttered from the crowd. Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Lydia's jaw tightened. She wore the same dress she'd worn to her father's funeral, plain black wool, high-necked, proper. Her dark hair was pinned back severely. She'd chosen this outfit deliberately, refusing to be displayed like merchandise. But it didn't matter what she wore. The men in this room saw only what they wanted to see. "The terms are simple," Crane said. "Miss Mercer will enter into bonded servitude with whoever settles the debt. Duration to be determined by the creditor, terms negotiable upon—" "I'll take her." Barrett's voice rolled across the saloon like thunder before a storm. 4,000, plus interest. Call it 5 even. No one bid against him. Of course they didn't. Bidding against Barrett Crow in Red Hollow was like spitting into a wildfire, pointless and guaranteed to burn you. Lydia felt the room closing in. $5,000 for a life. Her life. She'd become a number in a ledger, a line item to be checked off and filed away. In her mind, she ran through her options one more time, the way she'd done every night since they'd dragged her from her home. Run? They'd catch her before she reached the edge of town. Fight? Against armed men? She'd be dead before her fists connected. Appeal to the law? Sheriff Dalton was already counting whatever Barrett had paid him. There were no good options. There was only survival, and survival meant submission. Barrett pushed off from the bar and walked toward the platform with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no. His boots thudded against the wooden floor. Each step felt like a countdown. "Now, Barrett," Crane said, attempting something like propriety, "we should follow proper procedure. Allow time for other interested parties to—" "There are no other interested parties." Barrett didn't even look at the auctioneer. His eyes stayed locked on Lydia. "Are there?" Silence answered him. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that made Lydia's skin crawl. Not because it was cruel, but because it was pleased, satisfied. The smile of a man who'd wanted something and was about to take possession of it. "Then we're done here." Barrett reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the bar without looking. 5,000. Count it if you want. No one moved to count it. The money could have been Confederate scrip for all anyone cared. This transaction had nothing to do with currency and everything to do with power. Barrett mounted the platform. Up close, he smelled like expensive cologne and cattle. His hand reached for Lydia's arm, not roughly, but with the casual ownership of someone handling property they'd just purchased. "We're going to get along just fine," he said quietly, for her ears only. "You're a smart girl. Your daddy raised you right before he got careless up on that ridge." The words landed like a slap. Got careless. As if her father's death had been some kind of accident, some failure of attention rather than... The doors slammed open. Everyone turned. The man who entered was tall enough that he had to duck beneath the frame. He wore a coat made from wolf pelts, fur still rough and wild, and beneath it layers of buckskin and wool that belonged to mountains and winter rather than civilization. His face was hard angles and old scars, a diagonal line across his left cheek, another bisecting his right eyebrow. His hair was dark, long enough to touch his shoulders, shot through with premature gray. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and cold and utterly unreadable. Elias Varn. The name rippled through the crowd in whispers. Lydia had heard stories about him growing up, the mountain man who disappeared into the high country years ago, who killed a grizzly with a knife, who could track a ghost through solid rock. People said he'd gone mad from solitude. Others said he'd gone looking for gold and found something worse. No one had seen him in Red Hollow for at least 5 years. He crossed the saloon in 6 long strides, ice crystals still melting in his beard. Without a word, he dropped a leather sack onto the bar. It hit with a heavy thunk that made glasses jump. "Open it," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like gravel being dragged across metal. Crane fumbled with the drawstring. The bag's contents spilled across the bar, raw gold. Nuggets and dust still carrying traces of the stream that had birthed them. In the lamplight, they gleamed with the kind of purity that made men kill. The room went silent except for breathing. Crane stared at the gold like it might bite him. His hands shook as he tried to estimate the value. This is at least 15,000, Elias said flatly. "Weighed it myself this morning." Barrett's grip on Lydia's arm tightened. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw something other than confidence in his expression. Confusion. Anger. Calculation. "Now hold on," Barrett said, his voice still controlled but with new steel beneath it. "This auction is over. Terms have been met. The debt is settled." "Auction's not over until the auctioneer says it is." Elias didn't look at Barrett. He looked at Crane. "Isn't that right?" Crane swallowed hard. He glanced between Barrett and Elias like a man caught between 2 avalanches trying to decide which one would kill him faster. His hand trembled as he reached for the gavel. Technically, yes. If a higher bid is presented before the gavel, I already paid! Barrett's control was cracking now. Red crept up his neck. The money's on the bar. The deal is done. The gavel hasn't fallen, Elias said. Each word came out deliberate and measured. So the deal isn't done. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Lydia felt Barrett's fingers digging into her arm hard enough to bruise, felt the barely controlled violence vibrating through him. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, used to fear keeping everyone in line. But Elias Varn didn't look afraid. He looked patient, like he could stand there all night if necessary, while winter wind howled outside and the temperature dropped and everyone else froze solid. There was something ancient about his stillness, something that suggested he'd learned to wait the way mountains wait, without urgency, without doubt, with the absolute certainty that everything eventually comes to those who refuse to move. Sheriff Dalton cleared his throat. Now, Elias, you can't just... Can't what? Elias turned those pale eyes on the sheriff. Can't participate in a legal auction. Can't offer a higher bid? Which law am I breaking exactly? Dalton's hand drifted toward his gun, then stopped. Whatever he saw in Elias's face made him reconsider. The sheriff was on Barrett's payroll, sure, but he wasn't stupid. There were some men you didn't draw on unless you were absolutely certain you'd win. Crane's hand shook as he raised the gavel. If there are no further bids, there won't be. Elias's voice carried absolute certainty. Because there's no one here who can match what I've put down. So let's stop pretending and finish this. Barrett released Lydia's arm. He stepped off the platform, his movements tight with controlled fury. You think you can just walk in here after 5 years and... I think, Elias interrupted, That you orchestrated Jonathan Mercer's death so you could seize his daughter and whatever he found up in those mountains. I think you fabricated debt to give yourself legal cover, and I think everyone in this room knows it, but they're too scared to say so." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. No one denied it. Barrett's face went from red to white. His hand dropped to his belt, where a Colt revolver sat in a tooled leather holster. "That's a serious claim." "It's the truth." Elias still hadn't moved. "Jonathan was my partner. We filed claim together on a mineral deposit 3 months ago. He was coming back from the assay office when he died. Funny how that ledger of debt appeared the next day. Funny how it totaled just enough to make his daughter vulnerable." Lydia's breath caught. Partner? Her father had never mentioned a partner, never mentioned a claim. But then, he'd been secretive those last few months, disappearing into the high country for days at a time, returning with rock samples and a distracted air. "You're lying," Barrett said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "The claim's registered in Twin Forks," Elias said. "Filed under both our names, witnessed and notarized. You want to call me a liar? Go check the records." He paused. "But you already knew about it, didn't you? That's why Jonathan's dead." The room erupted in murmurs. People shifted, glanced at each other, recalculated their understanding of events. The narrative they'd accepted, tragic accident, unfortunate debt, was crumbling. Barrett's hand stayed on his gun. For a heartbeat, Lydia thought he might draw. Thought this whole thing would end in blood and smoke right here, right now. But Barrett was smarter than that. Violence in front of witnesses, even cowed witnesses, would raise questions, would bring territorial marshals, would threaten everything he'd built. He forced his hand away from the weapon, forced a smile that looked like it cost him years of his life. "You've made a bid," he said tightly. "Fine, but this isn't over." "Yes," Elias said. "It is." Crane's gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Sold," he whispered, "to Elias Varn." Lydia's legs nearly gave out. The platform seemed to tilt beneath her. Everything she'd braced herself for, Barrett's ownership, the inevitable degradation, the loss of self, suddenly wasn't happening. But what was happening instead felt equally terrifying. She was being transferred from one stranger to another, from a known devil to an unknown ghost. Elias crossed to the platform. Up close, he was even more imposing, at least 6.5 feet tall, shoulders broad from years of mountain labor, hands scarred and calloused. He smelled like pine smoke and cold air. He pulled a knife from his belt. Lydia flinched, but he simply cut the ropes binding her wrists. The blade moved with surgical precision, separating fiber without touching skin. "Can you ride?" His voice was quieter now, meant only for her. "Yes." Her own voice sounded strange to her ears, thin, uncertain. "Good. We're leaving. Now. I have things at my house. No time." He glanced toward Barrett, who stood with his men gathering around him like a storm forming. "They'll come for us before dawn. We need distance." "Come for us?" The words felt heavy. "But you paid. The debt is settled." Something almost like sadness crossed Elias's scarred face. "You think that matters? You think Barrett Crow lets people challenge him and walk away?" He shook his head. "Money was just the opening move. Now comes the real game." Outside, the wind picked up. Through the saloon's dirty windows, Lydia could see snow beginning to fall. The first storm of winter, arriving early and mean. Elias moved toward the door. Lydia hesitated, looking back at the faces she'd known her whole life. Mrs. Patterson, who'd given her peppermints as a child. Tommy Reeves, who'd asked to court her once. Sheriff Dalton, who'd taught her father to play chess. All of them looked away. All of them chose safety over righteousness. She turned and followed Elias into the night. The cold hit like a physical blow. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes, already coating the street in white. 2 horses waited at the hitching post, one a massive gray gelding that looked like it could kick through a wall, the other a smaller roan mare with intelligent eyes. "You take the mare," Elias said, unhitching both animals. "She's steady. Won't spook easy." Lydia pulled herself into the saddle, grateful that her father had insisted she learn to ride properly. The mare shifted beneath her but held steady. Elias mounted the gelding with the ease of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. Behind them, the saloon door banged open. Barrett stood in the doorway, backlit by lamplight, his silhouette sharp and angry. "This isn't finished, Varn," his voice carried across the street. "You hear me? This isn't finished." Elias didn't respond. He simply turned his horse north, toward the mountains, toward darkness and distance. Lydia followed, because what else was there to do? Behind them lay everything she'd ever known, ruined, corrupted, turned against her. Ahead lay nothing but questions and cold. They rode in silence through Red Hollow's outskirts, past the church where her mother was buried, past the schoolhouse where she'd learned to read, past the boundaries of civilization and into the wild country beyond. The snow fell harder. Wind cut through Lydia's wool dress like it was made of paper. She had no coat, no supplies, no idea where they were going. Just the horse beneath her and the silent man ahead, leading her into a wilderness that had swallowed better-prepared people whole. After an hour, she found her voice. "Where are we going?" "North." Elias didn't turn around. "Up into the high country, 3 days' ride in good weather, 5 in this." "And then what?" "Then we figure out how to stay alive." Not reassuring, but honest. They climbed higher as the night deepened. The trail, if it could even be called a trail, wound through dense pine forest, following ridgelines Lydia couldn't see in the dark. Elias navigated like he could read the landscape with his eyes closed, never hesitating, never second-guessing. The horses pushed through drifts that reached their knees, breath steaming in the freezing air. Lydia's hands went numb first, then her feet. Her dress, soaked through with snow, clung to her legs. She tried to stay in the saddle, tried to keep moving, but exhaustion and cold were dragging her down. Her vision started to blur. The mare's steady gait became a lullaby, pulling her towards sleep. Dangerous sleep. The kind you don't wake up from. "Hey!" Elias's voice cut through the fog. He'd stopped and turned back. "Stay with me. Don't you dare close those eyes." "I'm fine," she lied. Her tongue felt thick. "You're freezing to death." He dismounted and came to her side. Before she could protest, he pulled her off the mare and steadied her when her legs buckled. "Can't stop here. Not yet. But we need to keep you moving." He shrugged out of his wolf fur coat and draped it over her shoulders. The weight was enormous, the warmth immediate and shocking. Lydia wanted to protest. He'd freeze without it, but her body was already soaking in the heat, greedy and desperate. "You'll die," she managed through chattering teeth. "I'm used to it." He guided her back onto the mare, then remounted his own horse. "Keep that coat tight. We've got 2 more hours before we can make camp." 2 more hours. It felt impossible, but Lydia set her jaw and wrapped the coat closer. She'd survived Barrett Crow's auction. She'd survived her father's murder and the town's betrayal. She could survive 2 more hours on horseback. She had to, because the alternative was dying in the snow, and she refused to give Barrett Crow that satisfaction. They rode on through the storm. The world narrowed to the horse beneath her, the coat around her shoulders, the occasional glimpse of Elias's broad back ahead. Time lost meaning. There was only cold and movement and the stubborn refusal to quit. When Elias finally stopped, Lydia almost didn't notice. She'd retreated so far into herself, focusing only on staying conscious, that the cessation of motion felt wrong. "We're here," he said. Here was a small clearing beneath a rock overhang, barely visible in the darkness and snow. Natural shelter, protected from the worst of the wind. Elias moved with quick efficiency, unsaddling both horses and tying them where they could access a patch of frozen grass. Then he turned to Lydia. "Off the horse. Come on." She tried. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. She ended up sliding sideways, and Elias caught her before she hit the ground. For a moment she was pressed against his chest, could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat, could feel the cold radiating from him. He'd given her his coat and ridden for hours in nothing but buckskin and wool. He should have been hypothermic, but his hands were steady as he set her on her feet near the overhang. "Sit. Don't move." Lydia sat, watched as Elias gathered deadwood from beneath the snow, building a fire with practiced speed. Flint and steel sparked, kindling caught. Within minutes, flames were crawling up through larger branches, throwing heat and light into the small space. Only then did Lydia realize she was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. The warmth from the fire felt like knives stabbing into her frozen flesh. Painful, necessary. Elias produced a canvas pack and pulled out dried meat, hardtack, and a metal canteen. He handed her the canteen. "Drink, small sips. The water was ice cold but felt like salvation. Lydia forced herself to sip slowly, though her body screamed to gulp it down. When she lowered the canteen, Elias was watching her with those pale, unreadable eyes. Why? The question came out before she could stop it. Why did you do this? Do what? Save me. Pay all that gold. Risk Barrett's anger. She pulled the wolf coat tighter. You don't know me. I don't know you. My father never mentioned a partner. Elias fed another branch to the fire. For a long time, he didn't answer. The flames crackled. Snow fell outside their shelter. The horses shifted and breathed. Finally, your father was a good man. He trusted me with something valuable. I owed him. What did he trust you with? Truth. Elias glanced at her. About what we found, about what it means, about who'd kill for it. The mineral deposit? Yes. What is it? Gold? Silver? Copper. He said it simply. One of the richest veins I've ever seen, enough to make whoever controls it wealthy beyond measure. Your father knew it. We filed the claim together, planned to develop it slowly, carefully. But Barrett has spies everywhere. Someone talked. And then your father ended up dead at the bottom of Copper Ridge. Lydia's chest tightened. You're sure it wasn't an accident? Elias's expression hardened. I found him, saw the body before they moved it. Your father didn't fall. He was thrown. Had bruises on his arms where someone grabbed him. His surveying equipment was smashed, but his pack was intact. If it was a fall, the pack would have been torn apart. Someone wanted it to look like an accident. They did a sloppy job. The words landed like blows. Confirmation of what she'd suspected but couldn't prove. Murder. Calculated, cold-blooded murder. Why didn't you tell the sheriff? Because the sheriff works for Barrett. Everyone works for Barrett, or fears him. I came down from the mountains to settle this myself, but by the time I reached town, they'd already set the auction. He shook his head. Didn't have time to gather evidence or build a case, just had time to convert my gold dust and make a bid. Lydia stared into the fire. The flames danced, casting shadows across Elias's scarred face. Nothing about this made sense. If what he was saying was true, she was caught in the middle of something much larger than her father's death. A war over resources, over power, over a future written in copper and blood. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we survive the winter. Come spring, we file the proper claims, bring in territorial authorities Barrett can't control, and take back what's yours. Mine? Your father's claim passes to you. That makes you half owner of the richest copper deposit in the territory. He met her eyes. That's why Barrett wanted you, not for servitude, for control. If he owned you, he owned your inheritance. He could force you to sign over rights, or just keep you locked away until you weren't a problem anymore. The implications made Lydia's stomach turn. She'd thought she was being sold into degradation. Instead, she'd been currency in a much darker transaction. And you? She asked. What do you get out of this? Justice. The word came out hard. Your father was my friend. First one I'd had in a long time. He treated me like a human being instead of a ghost story. He trusted me. Elias paused. I don't let that go unpaid. Silence settled between them, broken only by the fire and the storm. Lydia studied the man across from her, this scarred, silent stranger who'd appeared from nowhere and upended everything. He was a contradiction, rough and civilized, violent and protective, isolated yet bound by loyalty. I don't know if I should thank you or be terrified of you, she admitted. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Probably both. Fair enough. Lydia pulled the wolf coat tighter and let exhaustion finally catch her. Her last thought before sleep took her was that she'd traded one kind of captivity for another. But this time, at least, her captor had saved her life instead of ending it. That had to count for something. When she woke, it was still dark, but the storm had passed. The fire had burned down to coals, but someone had kept it alive. Elias, sitting cross-legged on the other side of the embers, rifle across his knees, watching the tree line with predator focus. How long was I asleep? Lydia's voice came out rough. 3 hours. Sun's still 2 hours off. He didn't look at her. We need to move soon. Put more distance between us and Red Hollow. You think they'll follow? I know they will. He fed a branch to the coals, bringing light back to their small shelter. Barrett doesn't let challenges go unanswered. He'll send men. Maybe not today, but soon, before the passes close for winter. Lydia sat up, her body protesting every movement. Muscles she didn't know she had ached from hours of riding. But the cold had retreated, chased back by the coat and the fire and a few hours of rest. "How far to your cabin?" she asked. "2 days if we push hard, 3 if the weather turns again." Elias finally looked at her. "You holding up?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to project strength and competence, but lying seemed pointless. "I've never been this cold or this scared in my life, but I'm still here, still breathing, so I guess that counts." He nodded, something like respect crossing his face. "That counts." They broke camp as false dawn grayed the eastern sky. The horses were stiff from the cold, but willing. Elias helped Lydia into the saddle, his hands brief and impersonal, then mounted his own horse. They rode higher. The landscape transformed around them. The pine forest gave way to scrub and rock. The air thinned, making each breath a labor. Snow lay deeper here, unmarred except by animal tracks, deer, elk, something larger that might have been bear, the kind of country where people didn't go unless they had a reason, or were running from something. By noon, Lydia's world had shrunk to the rhythm of hoofbeats and the slow burn of frozen muscles coming back to life. She tried not to think about what waited behind them in Red Hollow, tried not to imagine Barrett's face when he realized his prize had escaped, tried not to count the ways this could all go wrong. "We're being followed." Elias's voice cut through her thoughts. He hadn't stopped riding, hadn't even turned around, but his posture had changed, alert, tense. "How do you know?" Lydia looked back but saw only trees and snow. Tracks, about an hour old, 3 riders, moving fast. He urged his horse forward. "They're pushing to catch us before nightfall. Can we outrun them? Not in this terrain, not with the horses already tired." He scanned the landscape ahead, calculating. "But we can make them wish they'd stayed home." He turned off the main trail, if it had even been a trail, and headed into rougher country. The horses picked their way through boulder fields and across frozen streams. The riding went from difficult to dangerous, each step a calculated risk. But Elias knew this land, knew it the way some men knew city streets or ships' rigging. He guided them along ridge lines, through narrow passes, into terrain that would swallow anyone who didn't know the way. Behind them, the pursuit continued. Lydia caught glimpses now, dark shapes moving through the trees, too far back to identify but close enough to be real. 3 men. Armed. Determined. Barrett's reach was longer than she'd hoped. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Elias pushed them harder, the horses laboring through drifts that reached their chests. Lydia clung to her mare, every instinct screaming that they were going to die out here, from cold or exhaustion or bullets in the back. Then Elias stopped. They stood at the edge of a narrow canyon, walls of rock rising on either side, a frozen creek at the bottom. The only way through was down a switchback trail so steep it looked suicidal. "Down there," Elias said. "Fast as you can. Don't think about it. Just follow my lead." He started down without waiting for confirmation. Lydia had no choice but to follow, the mare sliding and scrambling on ice-slick rock. Twice she thought they'd fall. Twice the horse found purchase and kept going. Elias moved ahead with reckless confidence, his gelding navigating the descent like it had been born to it. They reached the canyon floor as the last light died. Above them, on the rim, Lydia saw movement. Their pursuers had arrived, were looking down at the trail. "Come on!" Elias was already moving up the other side, where a cave entrance opened in the rock face. Not deep, but defensible. A bottleneck. Lydia urged her horse forward, up and into the cave mouth. Once inside, Elias dismounted and pulled his rifle, moving back to the entrance. "Stay with the horses," he said quietly. "Keep them calm. Don't make noise." What are... They have to come down single file. Narrow trail. Poor light. If they're smart, they'll wait for morning." He checked his rifle's load. "But men who work for Barrett aren't usually smart." Lydia's heart hammered. This was about to become real. Blood and violence and all the things she'd managed to avoid by living a proper, civilized life. That life was gone now. Minutes passed like hours. The canyon filled with darkness. Above, she could hear voices, arguing, debating. Then the sound of horses beginning the descent. They were coming. Elias settled into position, rifle braced against the cave wall, perfectly still, waiting. The first rider appeared on the trail below, just a shadow against snow, picking his way down the switchbacks. Then the second. The third stayed at the top, probably to cover their retreat. Standard tactics. Nothing creative. Elias let them get halfway down. Let them commit to the descent, where turning back would be nearly impossible. Then he fired. The shot cracked through the canyon like thunder. The lead horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider into the frozen creek below. The second rider tried to turn, his horse slipping on ice, both of them sliding toward the edge. Elias didn't fire again. Didn't need to. The message was clear: come down this canyon and die. The remaining riders scrambled back up the trail, leaving their companion unconscious in the snow. Voices echoed from above, angry and frightened, then silence. Elias lowered his rifle. They'll try again, or they'll wait us out. Either way, we're staying here tonight. Lydia realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, hands shaking. She'd just witnessed violence, controlled, calculated, effective. And she felt, what? Horror? Relief? Both? Is he dead? She couldn't see the fallen rider from here. Unconscious, maybe a broken bone or two. He'll live if his friends come get him. Elias moved back into the cave. Not my first choice, but I'm not killing men for doing their job. They came after us. I sent a message. Maybe they'll be smart and take it. He built another fire, smaller this time, deep in the cave where the light wouldn't be visible from above. The horses stamped and breathed, nervous from the gunfire, but settling. Lydia sat near the flames, watching Elias move through familiar routines, checking weapons, distributing supplies, scanning for threats. This was his world, violence and wilderness and the cold mathematics of survival, and now it was hers too. Thank you, she said quietly. He glanced at her. For what? For not killing them. For having limits. Something complicated crossed his face. Don't mistake restraint for weakness. If they come at us again, I won't hesitate. I know. And she did. This man had killed before. She could see it in the way he handled weapons, in the casual competence with which he defended their position. But you chose not to. That matters. Elias didn't respond, just fed the fire and stared into the flames like they held answers to questions he hadn't asked. Outside, the temperature dropped. Inside their shelter, warmth gathered. The horses drowsed, and Lydia sat wrapped in wolf fur, trying to process the last 24 hours of her life. Yesterday, she'd been sold like property. Today, she'd fled into the wilderness with a stranger. Tomorrow, who knew? But she was still breathing, still free, still herself. That would have to be enough. The night stretched on with the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Lydia dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time the fire popped or the horses shifted. Each time she found Elias in the same position, seated near the cave entrance, rifle across his knees, eyes on the darkness beyond. She wasn't sure if he slept at all. When gray light finally crept into the canyon, she sat up stiffly. Her whole body felt like one enormous bruise. The wolf coat had kept her alive, but comfort was a distant memory. Elias stood and moved to the cave mouth, scanning the rim above. After a long moment, he turned back. They're gone. Pulled out maybe 2 hours ago. How can you tell? Tracks in fresh snow, they headed back the way they came. He shouldered his rifle. Doesn't mean they won't try again, just means they're regrouping. We need to move. Lydia forced herself to stand, her legs protesting. Every muscle screamed. She'd ridden before, sure, but never like this. Hours in the saddle in freezing conditions running for her life. The reality of what lay ahead settled over her like a weight. 2 more days of this. Minimum. Elias watched her struggle to her feet, his expression unreadable. You need to eat something. He handed her a strip of dried venison and more hardtack. It tasted like salted leather, but Lydia chewed mechanically, forcing it down. Food was fuel now, nothing more. They saddled the horses in silence. The mare nuzzled Lydia's shoulder, and she found herself grateful for the animal's warmth, its steady presence. At least the horse didn't judge her for being completely out of her depth. The ascent out of the canyon was worse than the descent. The trail seemed even narrower in daylight, every loose rock and patch of ice clearly visible. One wrong step and they'd tumble hundreds of feet. But the horses climbed steadily, and Elias guided them with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything. When they finally reached the top, Lydia looked back down at the frozen creek where the rider had fallen. He was gone. His companions must have retrieved him during the night. A dark stain on the snow marked where he'd landed. "Will Barrett send more?" she asked. "Eventually." Elias urged his horse forward. "But the passes are closing. Another few storms, and this route won't be passable until spring. He'll have to wait." Small comfort. It just meant they were trapped up here for months with limited supplies and the certainty that come thaw, armed men would be coming. They rode through country that didn't look like it should exist. Massive granite formations thrust up from the snow like broken teeth. Frozen waterfalls hung suspended in mid-cascade, ice catching the weak sunlight and throwing it back in fractured rainbows. The air was so thin and cold it hurt to breathe, and yet there was a terrible beauty to it. A kind of purity Lydia had never experienced in Red Hollow, where everything was stained with compromise and fear. By midday, her earlier exhaustion had been replaced by something worse, a bone-deep cold that no amount of movement could shake. Her hands were numb inside her gloves. Her face felt frozen. The wolf coat helped, but it couldn't work miracles. Elias called a halt near a cluster of wind-twisted pines. "We'll rest the horses. 10 minutes." Lydia slid from the saddle and immediately sat down in the snow, too tired to care about the wet cold seeping through her dress. Elias produced the canteen and handed it to her. The water was ice cold, almost painful to swallow. "How do you stand it?" she asked. "The cold, the isolation." He was checking the horse's hooves, making sure ice hadn't built up in the shoes. "You get used to it, or you don't, and you leave. And you chose to stay." "I chose to stop running." He moved to her mare, working methodically. Spent years in cities and towns, always moving, never settling. Too many people asking questions, too many expectations. He paused. "Up here, nobody asks. Nobody expects. You just survive or you don't." "What were you running from?" The question hung between them. For a moment, Lydia thought he wouldn't answer. Then he straightened, meeting her eyes. "The war, what it did to me, what I did during it." His voice was flat, factual. "I was a sharpshooter, good at it, too good. When it ended, I couldn't go back to pretending I was civilized, so I stopped pretending." Lydia had heard stories about the war. Everyone had. It had ended 12 years ago, but the scars ran deep. Men came back changed, hollow-eyed, unable to fit into the lives they'd left behind. "My father never talked about his service," she said quietly. "Smart man." Elias finished with the horses and moved to stand near the tree line, scanning their back trail. Some things don't need words. They rode on. The landscape grew even more forbidding, sheer cliffs, narrow ledges, places where one misstep would mean death. Lydia tried not to look down, tried to trust her horse and the man ahead of her. Trust was all she had. As afternoon bled toward evening, the terrain finally began to level out slightly. They entered a high valley, sheltered on 3 sides by peaks that looked like they scraped the sky. The snow here was deeper but undisturbed, no tracks, no signs of human passage. "We're close," Elias said. It was the first he'd spoken in hours. 20 minutes later, Lydia saw it. The cabin sat against the eastern wall of the valley, built into the rock face itself so that it seemed to grow from the stone. It was larger than she'd expected. Not some ramshackle shelter, but a proper structure with a stone chimney, shuttered windows, and a covered porch. A smaller building nearby probably served as a stable. Smoke rose from the chimney. Lydia's hand moved instinctively toward the knife Elias had given her that morning. "Someone's here." "No." Elias didn't seem concerned. "I bank the fire before I leave, slow burn. Keeps the place from freezing solid." They approached cautiously anyway. The horses perked up, sensing shelter and rest. Elias dismounted first, rifle ready, and checked the perimeter. Only when he was satisfied did he wave Lydia forward. "Come on, let's get you inside before you freeze to death." The stable was surprisingly well maintained. Clean stalls, fresh straw that must have been brought up before the snows came, even a small tack room. Elias unsaddled both horses with efficient movements, rubbing them down and making sure they had water and feed. "You built all this?" Lydia asked, looking around. "Over 3 years, little by little." He hung the saddles on wooden pegs. Had help sometimes. Your father came up a few times, helped with the roofing. The mention of her father hit harder than expected. Lydia steadied herself against a stall door. Did he know? That you were planning to leave me everything if something happened to him? We had an agreement. If either of us died, the survivor would look after the other's family. Elias's voice was quiet. I never expected to have to keep that promise. He led her to the cabin. The door was thick oak, reinforced with iron. Inside, darkness gave way gradually as Elias moved to the fireplace and coaxed the banked coals back to life. Flames caught and spread, throwing light across a space that made Lydia stop and stare. This wasn't a hermit's hovel. Books lined shelves along one wall, dozens of them, maybe over 100. Engineering texts, surveying manuals, botanical guides, even novels. A large table dominated the center of the room, covered with maps and drawings. In one corner sat a proper desk with drafting tools arranged precisely. The opposite corner held a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove, shelves of preserved food, and copper pots hanging from hooks. A ladder led to a sleeping loft above. Everything was clean, organized, purposeful, the home of someone who'd chosen isolation but not chaos. I don't understand, Lydia said. The stories about you, they made you sound half wild. People see what they expect to see. Elias fed more wood to the fire. I come to town maybe twice a year, always look like I've been living rough because I have been. They assume that's all there is. He gestured around the cabin. This is different. This is mine. The fire grew, pushing back the cold. Lydia moved closer to it, finally starting to feel her fingers and toes again. The warmth was almost painful. Elias disappeared into the kitchen area and returned with a pot, which he filled with snow and hung over the fire. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the burnt acorn garbage they serve in Red Hollow. I didn't know you could still get real coffee this far from civilization. I know a trader in Twin Forks, smuggles it up from Mexico. He pulled out 2 tin cups. Costs a fortune, but some things are worth it. While the water heated, Elias showed her the basics of the cabin. The pump in the kitchen brought up water from an underground spring, cold but clean and endless. The root cellar held enough food for months if rationed carefully. The loft had a real mattress stuffed with pine needles and wool, plus heavy blankets and furs. You'll sleep up there, he said. I'll take the floor down here. That's not negotiable. His tone left no room for argument. You need real rest. I sleep light anyway. The coffee finished brewing. Elias poured 2 cups and handed her one. Lydia wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth before taking a sip. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. Rich and dark and real. Nothing like the bitter substitute she'd grown up drinking. She closed her eyes and let the heat spread through her chest. Thank you, she said, and meant it for more than just the coffee. Elias nodded and took his own cup to the window, looking out at the valley now filling with evening shadows. We'll stay here until spring. Barrett can't reach us once the passes close. Come April, we'll head to Twin Forks, file the proper paperwork, bring in territorial authorities. Make this legal and permanent. And if he finds a way through the passes, he won't. Elias's certainty was absolute. I've seen men try to cross in deep winter. They don't come back. Lydia wanted to share his confidence, but she'd seen Barrett's face when Elias had challenged him. That wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully. Still, for now, they were safe. Or as safe as anyone could be on a mountain in winter. She finished her coffee and felt exhaustion crash over her like a wave. 3 days of running, sleeping on frozen ground, riding until her body screamed. It all caught up at once. I need to lie down, she said. Go. I'll make something to eat. Bring it up later. Lydia climbed the ladder to the loft. The space was small but efficient, just room for the mattress and a few storage chests. She collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, still wrapped in the wolf coat, and was asleep before her head settled into the pillow. She dreamed of her father. They were in his study back in Red Hollow, and he was showing her a map. See here, he said, pointing to a spot in the mountains. This is where everything changes. This is where we take back what's ours. But when she looked closer, the map was covered in blood, and her father's voice changed, became Barrett's voice. You can't escape. You're mine. You've always been mine. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding. Darkness pressed in from all sides. For a panicked moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she heard the fire crackling below, smelled pine smoke and coffee, remembered the cabin, the mountains. Safety, for now. She sat up slowly, muscles protesting. Through the gaps in the loft floorboards, she could see Elias at the table below, bent over one of his maps by lamplight. He'd spread several across the surface and was making notations with a pencil. "You're awake." He didn't look up. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." Lydia climbed down the ladder, moving carefully on stiff legs. A pot sat warming on the cast iron stove. She ladled some into a bowl and tasted it. Venison, potatoes, wild onions, herbs she couldn't identify. Rich and filling and exactly what her body needed. She carried the bowl to the table and sat across from Elias. Up close she could see what he was working on, detailed surveys of the surrounding mountains with elevation markers and resource notations. "Did you make these?" she asked. "Most of them. Your father helped with the Copper Valley surveys." He tapped one map. "This is where we filed the claim. 3 square miles of some of the richest deposits I've ever seen." Lydia studied the maps. Her father had taught her to read surveys. It was impossible to grow up as Jonathan Mercer's daughter without learning the basics of his trade. What she saw here was meticulous work, professional grade. "You said you were a sharpshooter in the war." "I was. But you're also a surveyor, an engineer from the looks of these drawings." Elias set down his pencil. "I was a lot of things before the war. Grew up in Boston, went to a technical college. My father wanted me to build bridges." He paused. "Then Fort Sumter happened, and I ended up building death instead." There was no self-pity in his voice, just statement of fact. "Why not go back? After the war, you could have rebuilt your life." "I tried." He rolled up one of the maps carefully. "Lasted 6 months in Philadelphia working for a construction firm. Couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Kept seeing enemy soldiers in every shadow. One day I just left. Walked out during lunch and kept walking until I ran out of East." Lydia ate her stew slowly, watching him. This man was a puzzle. Educated but isolated. Capable of both precise engineering and sudden violence. Helping her for reasons that still didn't completely make sense. "Your father understood," Elias continued. "He'd served too. Different regiment, different battles, but the same war. When we met, we didn't have to explain anything to each other. We just knew." "How did you meet?" "He came up here surveying for the territorial government 3 years ago. Got caught in a spring storm, nearly died of exposure. I found him halfway frozen and brought him here." A slight smile crossed Elias's scarred face. "He recovered. We talked. Realized we both saw the world the same way. After that, he'd come up every few months. We'd explore, survey, look for resources. The copper deposit was pure luck. A rock slide exposed the vein. We knew immediately what we had. And you trusted each other enough to file a claim together." "We did." The smile faded. "I trusted him with my life. And he trusted me with his daughters." The weight of that trust hung in the air. Lydia set down her empty bowl and looked directly at Elias. "I need to understand something. You paid $15,000 for me. You're protecting me. You've given up your isolation, brought danger to your doorstep. Why? And don't tell me it's just about honoring my father's memory." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a leather-bound journal. He opened it to a marked page and slid it across the table. Lydia recognized her father's handwriting immediately. The entry was dated 2 months before his death. "Met with E today. Finalized the claim paperwork. If anything happens to me, I've made my wishes clear. Lydia inherits my half, and E is to serve as executor and protector until she's safe. Barrett Crow has been asking too many questions. I fear I've been careless. If the worst happens, I trust E completely. He's the only man I know with the strength and honor to keep my daughter from becoming a victim of my mistakes." Lydia's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to cry. Her father had known, had seen the danger coming and tried to protect her the only way he could. "He wrote that 3 days before he died," Elias said quietly. "I found the journal in his effects when I went to settle things. It confirmed what I already knew, that I had a responsibility." "So you came down from your mountain to honor a dead man's wishes." "I came down because your father was right. Barrett would have destroyed you to get what he wanted. Someone had to stop that." Elias closed the journal. Your father gave me friendship when I needed it, gave me purpose when I'd lost mine. This is how I repay that debt. Lydia wiped her eyes roughly. I'm not your responsibility. No. You're your own person, but you're also my partner now, whether either of us planned for it. He met her gaze steadily. Half that copper deposit is yours by right. That makes us business partners, and partners protect each other. It was a different kind of arrangement than Lydia had expected. Not charity, not obligation born of pity, partnership, equality, or as close to it as possible given the circumstances. I don't know anything about mining or business, she admitted. You'll learn. You're smart. Your father made sure of that, and you're tougher than you think. Something that might have been respect crossed his face. You survived the auction, survived 3 days on horseback through terrain that kills experienced travelers. You're still standing. That counts for more than you know. Lydia looked down at her hands. They were rougher than they'd been a week ago, nails broken, skin chapped from cold. The hands of someone who'd left civilization behind. What happens if Barrett finds a way up here? She asked. Before spring, I mean. Then we fight. Elias said it simply. This valley has natural defenses. I've got weapons, ammunition, supplies. If he comes, we'll be ready. I've never shot anyone. Hope you won't have to. But if it comes to it, he pulled a revolver from his belt and set it on the table. I'll teach you, tomorrow. Can't have a partner who can't defend herself. The gun sat between them like a challenge. Lydia stared at it, trying to imagine herself pulling the trigger, taking a life. A week ago, it would have seemed impossible. Now it just seemed necessary. All right, she said. Teach me. The next morning broke clear and brutally cold. Lydia woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, luxuries that seemed impossible in this remote place, but that Elias produced with casual efficiency. Eat, he said when she climbed down from the loft. Then we start your education. They spent the morning outside despite the cold. Elias set up targets against the far wall of the valley, pieces of wood with charcoal marks indicating center mass. Then he handed Lydia the revolver. It's a Colt .45, 6 shots, heavy recoil, so brace yourself. He showed her how to hold it properly, how to sight, how to breathe through the shot. Don't jerk the trigger, squeeze smooth and steady. Lydia's first shot went wide, the recoil jarring her shoulders. The second missed entirely. By the fifth, she was starting to understand the rhythm. Better, Elias said. But you're still anticipating the recoil. Trust the weapon. Let it do its job. They practiced for 2 hours. By the end, Lydia could hit the target more often than not, though her hands shook from cold and her ears rang despite the cloth Elias had given her to stuff in them. That's enough for today, he said. You did well. I missed more than I hit. You hit enough. And you didn't panic or freeze. That's what matters. He took the revolver and cleaned it methodically. Accuracy comes with practice. Nerve is something you either have or you don't. They returned to the cabin for lunch. More hardtack, dried fruit, cheese that Elias had somehow kept fresh in the cold. While they ate, he pulled out more maps. I need you to understand the valley, he said. Where the approaches are, where the defenses are, where to go if we get separated. He traced routes with his finger. This is the main trail we came in on, only practical access most of the year. But there are 2 other routes, here and here. Goat paths, really. Almost impossible to use, but desperate men might try. Lydia studied the maps, committing details to memory. Her father had taught her that knowledge of terrain was survival. She'd never expected to need that lesson like this. The cabin's built against solid rock, Elias continued. Can't be flanked from behind. The stable's far enough away that if it burns, we're safe. I've got supplies cached in 3 locations, he marked them on the map, in case we can't reach the cabin. You've thought of everything. I've had 3 years to prepare for worst-case scenarios. He rolled up the maps. Didn't think those scenarios would involve defending against a cattle baron's private army, but the principles are the same. The afternoon passed in more lessons. Elias showed her how to read the sky for coming weather, how to find water under ice, how to build a fire that wouldn't smoke and give away your position. Survival skills accumulated like armor. As evening fell, they sat by the fire. Lydia's body ached from the day's exertions, but it was a good ache, the ache of muscles being used, of purpose being found. Can I ask you something? She said. Elias looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. Go ahead. Do you ever get lonely up here? He considered the question. Sometimes, especially the first year. But lonely is different from alone. Alone I can handle. It's crowds that suffocate me now. I think I'm starting to understand that. He nodded. Red Hollow looked safe because it was familiar. But familiarity isn't the same as safety. Sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones we know best. Lydia thought about the auction, about the faces she'd known her whole life, all of them looking away, about the sheriff who'd taken Barrett's money without hesitation. Elias was right. Red Hollow had never been safe. It had just been a pretty lie. My father used to say that civilization is just wilderness with better manners, she said. I never understood what he meant until now. Your father was a wise man. Elias set aside the rifle. The wilderness is honest, at least. It'll kill you, sure, but it won't pretend to be your friend first. They fell into silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that comes when two people don't need to fill every moment with words. Outside, wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm. Lydia found herself thinking about the future, about what would happen come spring when they tried to reclaim what was theirs, about whether she could actually pull a trigger if it came down to it, about whether this strange partnership with a scarred mountain man could actually work. No answers came, just more questions. But for the first time since her father died, she felt something other than fear. She felt ready. The first major storm hit 5 days after they arrived. Lydia woke to a sound like the world ending, wind screaming across the valley with such force that the cabin walls groaned. She climbed down from the loft to find Elias already up, checking the shutters and reinforcing them with wooden bars. How bad? She asked. Bad enough. He didn't stop working. Could last 3 days, maybe 4. We'll be snowed in completely. Through gaps in the shutters, Lydia could see nothing but white. The storm had erased the world, leaving only howling chaos. She moved to help Elias secure the last window, her hands clumsy with sleep and cold. The horses? Stables built solid. They'll be fine. He tested each bar, making sure nothing would give. We just need to wait it out. Waiting turned out to be harder than riding through gunfire. The storm raged for 4 days straight. The wind never stopped, not even for a moment. Snow piled against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in the bucket by the door, despite the fire burning constantly. Elias rationed the firewood carefully, burning just enough to keep them from freezing. They wore every layer they owned and still shivered. At night, the cold was so intense that Lydia could see her breath even inside, even wrapped in furs. On the second day, cabin fever started to set in. The space that had seemed adequate now felt suffocating. Lydia paced, unable to settle, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't outrun. What was happening in Red Hollow? Had Barrett sent more men? Would they try to cross despite the storms? How long could she and Elias survive up here, trapped in this valley with winter bearing down like a fist? You're going to wear a hole in the floor, Elias said from his spot by the fire. He was repairing a leather harness, his hands moving with methodical precision. I can't just sit. Lydia stopped pacing but didn't sit down. I need to do something. Then do something useful. He gestured to the bookshelf. Read, or there's mending that needs doing. Or you could practice your knots. I've got rope. It wasn't what she wanted, but he was right. Restless energy with no outlet was just anxiety with extra steps. She grabbed a book at random, a surveying manual, and forced herself to sit at the table. The words blurred at first. Her mind kept wandering to Red Hollow, to her father's grave, to Barrett Crow's satisfied smile. But gradually the technical language pulled her in. Triangulation methods, elevation calculations, the mathematics of measuring land. Her father had tried to teach her this once. She'd been 14 and impatient, more interested in novels than numbers. Now she wished she'd paid better attention. You understand any of that? Elias asked after an hour of silence. Some. Lydia looked up. Enough to know I should have learned this years ago. Your father said you were smart, said you picked things up quick when you cared about them. He set aside his work. Question is whether you care about this. I don't have much choice, do I? Half that copper deposit is mine. I need to understand what that means. There's always a choice. Elias stood and moved to the stove, pouring coffee. You could sign over your half to me, take a settlement, disappear somewhere Barrett can't reach you. Start fresh. The offer hung in the air. Lydia closed the book slowly. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter. I'm giving you options. He brought her a cup of coffee. This life isn't easy. Even if we survive Barrett, even if we successfully work the claim, you're looking at years of hard living in rough country. You could have an easier path. Lydia wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the fire crackled. And she thought about easy paths, the ones that led to auction blocks and forced servitude, the ones paved with fear and compromise. Easy paths are how I ended up standing on a platform being sold like cattle, she said quietly. I'm done with easy. I want what's mine. Something shifted in Elias's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. All right, then. Let's make sure you know what you're fighting for. He spent the next hour explaining the copper deposit in detail, the quality of the ore, the estimated value, the logistics of extraction and transport, the challenges they'd face bringing in equipment, hiring workers, establishing operations in terrain that fought human presence at every turn. We're looking at 5 years minimum before we see real profit, he said, spreading maps across the table. Maybe 10, and that's if everything goes right, which it won't. But it's possible. It's possible. He traced the survey lines her father had drawn. Your father and I, we weren't just dreamers. We ran the numbers, did the geology. This deposit is real, and it's worth the fight. Lydia studied the maps with new eyes. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was her future, written in topographic lines and mineral surveys. Teach me, she said, everything. I want to understand it all. So Elias taught her. Over the next 2 days, while the storm raged outside, he walked her through surveying basics, mineral assessment, claim law. He showed her how to read geological formations, how to calculate ore density, how to estimate extraction costs. Some of it went over her head, but she absorbed what she could and asked questions about the rest. You're picking this up faster than I expected, Elias admitted on the third day. I had a good teacher once. Lydia didn't look up from the calculation she was working through. I just wasn't ready to learn. When the storm finally broke on the 5th morning, the silence was almost shocking. Lydia woke to stillness and pale sunlight filtering through the shutters. She climbed down to find Elias already removing the bars from the windows. The world outside had been transformed. Snow had buried everything under 6 feet of white. The valley looked like a pristine painting, unmarked except by the wind patterns carved into the drifts. The sky was hard blue, cloudless, beautiful and merciless. We need to check the horses, Elias said, pulling on his coat. Then dig out the pathways before the next storm hits. The work was brutal. They spent hours shoveling snow, creating channels between the cabin and stable and the various supply caches. Lydia's shoulders burned. Her hands blistered even through gloves. But she kept digging, kept moving, because stopping meant freezing. The horses had weathered the storm well, though they were restless from confinement. Elias let them out into a cleared area to stretch and move. Lydia leaned against the stable wall, catching her breath, watching the animals kick up snow with something like joy. How many more storms like that, she asked. Could be a dozen, could be 20. Elias was checking the stable's roof, making sure the weight of the snow hadn't damaged anything. Winter up here doesn't follow rules, it just keeps coming until it doesn't. That night, exhausted from the day's labor, Lydia fell asleep almost immediately, but she woke sometime in the dark hours to the sound of voices below. No, not voices, just one voice, Elias talking in his sleep. She moved to the edge of the loft and looked down. He was on his bedroll near the fire, thrashing slightly, words tumbling out in a rough whisper. Hold position. They're flanking left. Stevens is down. Stevens is down. A nightmare. War memories surfacing in sleep. Lydia climbed down quietly. She'd seen this before. Her father had nightmares too, especially in the early years after he came home. She knelt beside Elias, unsure whether to wake him or let it pass. He woke on his own with a sharp intake of breath, hand going for the knife he kept by his bedroll. Then he saw her and stopped, recognition cutting through the panic. Sorry, he said roughly. Did I wake you? It's fine, Lydia sat back on her heels. My father had them too, the nightmares. Elias sat up, running a hand through his hair. In the firelight, he looked older, the scars on his face more pronounced. They come and go. Usually I can keep them quiet. You were calling for someone. Stevens? His jaw tightened. My spotter. Took a bullet meant for me at Kennesaw Mountain. He was quiet for a moment. Died 3 hours later. Kept apologizing for missing the shot, like it was his fault the enemy got lucky. Lydia didn't know what to say. What words could possibly address that kind of loss? You don't have to talk about it, she offered. I know. But he kept talking anyway, voice low and rough. I was good at killing from a distance. Too good. They gave me medals for it, commendations, like it was something to be proud of. He stared into the fire. After Stevens died, I started missing on purpose. Took shots I knew would wound but not kill. Command noticed, called it combat fatigue, sent me home. That's why you came up here, to get away from it. To stop pretending it didn't change me. He looked at her directly. War doesn't leave you. It just becomes part of who you are. You either accept that, or you spend the rest of your life running from yourself. Lydia understood that more than she would have a week ago. She'd been changed too, by her father's death, by the auction, by everything that had happened since. The girl who'd lived in Red Hollow was gone. Someone else was emerging in her place. Do you regret it? She asked. Leaving civilization behind? No. His answer was immediate. I regret the war. Regret the things I did, the things I saw. But coming here? He shook his head. This was the first honest decision I made in years. They sat in silence for a while, the fire burning low between them. Finally, Elias added more wood and lay back down. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we start the real work. The real work turned out to be preparing for the possibility of siege. Over the next week, Elias had Lydia help him inventory their defenses. They checked the ammunition supply, enough for a prolonged fight if it came to that. They organized the food stores, calculating exactly how long they could hold out if they couldn't leave the valley. They identified sight lines and firing positions, places where 1 or 2 defenders could hold off a larger force. You really think Barrett will try to come through? Lydia asked as they marked defensive positions on a map. I think Barrett's the kind of man who can't accept losing. Elias made a notation. And I think he's got enough money to hire men desperate or stupid enough to try the passes even in winter. So we prepare for the worst. We prepare for the probable. He rolled up the map. And hope we're wrong. But hoping didn't mean stopping. Elias was relentless in his preparations, and Lydia matched him step for step. She practiced with the revolver daily, her accuracy improving as muscle memory developed. She learned to move through the snow quietly, to read tracks, to spot approaches before they became threats. And slowly, she learned to think like someone who might have to fight. It was a strange transformation. The Lydia who'd stood on that auction platform wouldn't have recognized the woman who now checked weapons and calculated fields of fire. But that Lydia was gone, buried under snow and necessity. 2 weeks after the first storm, a second one hit. Then a third. The valley became a fortress of ice and wind, completely isolated from the outside world. The passes were impassable now, Elias assured her. No one could get through until spring. Lydia wanted to believe him. But on a clear morning in early December, she woke to find Elias standing at the window, rifle in hand, staring out at the valley. What is it? She climbed down quickly. Tracks. His voice was tight. Fresh. Made sometime in the night. Lydia moved to the window. At first she saw nothing but snow and sunlight. Then Elias pointed, and she saw them. A line of depressions leading from the eastern approach toward the cabin. Too large to be animal tracks, too deliberate to be random. Someone was out there. How many? Her hand went to the revolver Elias had given her, now a constant presence at her hip. I can't tell from here, at least 2, maybe more. He moved to the door. Stay inside, keep the rifle ready. If I'm not back in an hour, bar the door and don't open it for anyone. You're not going out there alone. Yes, I am. He pulled on his coat and checked his weapons. If it's a trap, they'll want both of us in the open. This way, at least one of us stays protected. Lydia wanted to argue, but she understood the logic. Still, watching him step out into the snow felt wrong. Felt like abandoning him. She positioned herself at the window, rifle braced, watching. Elias moved across the valley with careful precision, following the tracks. They led toward a cluster of rocks on the eastern edge. Natural cover, a good ambush point. He approached slowly, rifle ready. Then he stopped, lowered his weapon, and knelt in the snow. Lydia's heart hammered. What was he doing? Why wasn't he defending himself? 5 minutes passed. 10. Then Elias stood and started back toward the cabin, carrying something in his arms. When he got closer, Lydia saw what it was and her breath caught. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wrapped in inadequate clothing, skin blue-white with cold. Elias shouldered through the door and carried the boy straight to the fire. Get blankets, all of them, and heat water. We need to warm him slowly or his heart will stop. Lydia moved on instinct, grabbing every blanket and fur she could find. Together they wrapped the child, rubbing his limbs gently to restore circulation. The boy's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Is he alive? Barely. Elias worked with focused intensity. But he won't be for long if we can't get his core temperature up. They spent the next hour fighting for the boy's life, warming him by degrees, forcing small sips of heated broth between his lips, watching for the moment when his body would either accept the warmth or surrender to the cold. Finally, color began to return to his face. His breathing deepened, his eyes fluttered open, brown, confused, terrified. It's all right, Lydia said softly. You're safe now. The boy tried to speak but couldn't manage words, just a weak sound that might have been crying if he'd had the strength for it. Don't talk yet, Elias said. Just rest. You're safe. But even as he said it, Lydia saw the question in his eyes, the same question she was thinking. Where'd this child come from, and where were his people? The answer came 2 hours later when the boy had warmed enough to speak in broken whispers. His name was Thomas. He was 8. He'd been traveling with his family, mother, father, older sister, trying to reach the territorial capital before winter closed the passes. They'd hired a guide in Red Hollow who swore he knew a route through the mountains. The guide worked for Barrett Crow, Thomas whispered, his voice thin and damaged. Heard Papa say it. They had a fight about the money. Lydia and Elias exchanged glances. A guide working for Barrett, leading a family into the mountains in late fall. Nothing about that was coincidence. Where's your family now? Elias asked gently. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. The storm came. We tried to find shelter, but the guide said we had to keep moving. Papa argued. The guide got angry. He stopped, struggling with the memory. There was a fight. The guide pushed Papa. Papa fell. Where is? Elias's voice was still gentle but urgent. Where did this happen? The narrow place, with the big rocks. Thomas was shaking now, not from cold, but from trauma. Mama told me to run, said to find help. I ran and ran, but I got lost and it was so cold. He dissolved into tears. Lydia pulled him close, letting him cry against her shoulder while her mind raced. A family stranded in the mountains. A guide who deliberately led them into danger. All of it connected to Barrett Crow. This wasn't just about her and Elias anymore. We have to find them, she said. I know. Elias was already moving, gathering gear. But the boy stays here. He's too weak to travel. I'll stay with him. No. Elias stopped and looked at her. You're coming with me. If there are survivors, we'll need 2 people to get them back here. Thomas can stay by the fire. It's warm, there's food, and we'll be back before nightfall. It was a risk leaving the boy alone, but Elias was right. They couldn't save anyone if they didn't have the manpower to move them. Lydia made sure Thomas was comfortable, showed him where the food and water were, and promised they'd return soon. Then she and Elias headed into the White. The narrow place with the big rocks turned out to be a canyon pass about 2 miles east. They followed Thomas's tracks backward, moving as fast as the deep snow allowed. The temperature was dropping again. Another storm coming, Lydia could feel it in the air. They found the father first. He lay at the bottom of a steep slope, neck bent at an angle that told the whole story. Elias checked for a pulse anyway, but found nothing. They couldn't bury him. The ground was frozen solid, so they marked the location and kept searching. The mother and sister were huddled together in a shallow cave, barely conscious. They'd built a small fire that had long since died, and now they were simply waiting to freeze. The older girl, maybe 13, opened her eyes when Elias entered the cave. Thomas? She whispered. Alive, at our cabin. Elias was already wrapping them in the blankets he'd brought. Can you walk? I think so. The girl tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Malnutrition, exposure, shock, all of it written on her face. The mother was in worse shape, barely responsive, her lips blue, her breathing irregular. Elias lifted her carefully while Lydia supported the daughter. We need to move fast, he said. Storm's coming. Getting them back to the cabin was a nightmare. The girl kept stumbling, too weak to maintain her footing. The mother was dead weight in Elias's arms, and the storm Lydia had sensed was building rapidly, wind picking up, visibility dropping. They made it back just as the first heavy snow began to fall. Thomas cried out when he saw his sister and mother trying to get up despite his weakness. Lydia settled him back down while Elias worked on the mother with the same focused intensity he'd shown with Thomas. But some damage ran too deep. The mother, her name was Catherine, never fully regained consciousness. She lingered for 2 days, her body trying to fight, but her core temperature too damaged to recover. The daughter, Margaret, sat with her constantly, holding her hand, whispering things only they could hear. Catherine died on a quiet morning with her children beside her. They buried her when the storm passed, as deep as they could dig in the frozen ground. Elias fashioned a marker from wood and carved her name into it. Thomas and Margaret stood silent in the snow, 2 children who'd lost everything in the span of a week. That night, with the children finally asleep in the loft, Lydia and Elias sat by the fire. Barrett did this, Lydia said quietly. That guide worked for him. This was deliberate. I know. Elias's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone he used when he was containing something dangerous. Question is why? What did that family have that Barrett wanted? Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just a message. To us. Lydia stared into the flames. Proof that he can reach into these mountains whenever he wants, that we're not as safe as we think. Elias didn't argue. They both knew she was right. The valley wasn't a fortress, it was a trap, and Barrett was patient enough to let winter do his work for him. The cabin wasn't built for 5 people. Thomas and Margaret settled into the space with the quiet wariness of children who'd learned that safety could vanish in an instant. They helped where they could, fetching water, tending the fire, staying out of the way when the adults needed to talk. But their presence changed everything. The supplies that would have lasted 2 people through winter now had to stretch to 5. The careful rationing Elias had planned went out the window. We've got maybe 3 months of food if we're careful, he said one night after the children had gone to sleep. He kept his voice low, but Lydia could hear the tension in it. 4 if we supplement with hunting, but the game's scarce this high up in deep winter. What about the caches you mentioned? The supply drops? Those are emergency reserves, last resort stuff. He rubbed his face, exhaustion showing in the gesture. I planned for 1 winter, 1 person, with maybe occasional guests. Not this. Lydia understood what he wasn't saying. The children had complicated everything. They couldn't be sent away. Not in this weather. Not with nowhere to go. But keeping them alive might mean all of them starving come March. We'll figure it out, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Will we? Elias looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something like doubt in his eyes. Barrett's not done. That guy didn't act alone. This was planned. Lure a family into the mountains, strand them, send a message that these peaks aren't safe, even in the dead of winter. Then we make ourselves harder to kill, with 2 children to protect? He shook his head. Every defense I planned assumed mobility, assumed we could move fast if we needed to. Can't do that now. He was right, but Lydia refused to accept defeat. So we adapt, change the plan, use what we have. And what do we have? High ground, knowledge of terrain, winter working for us instead of against us. She moved to the maps spread across the table. You said the valley has natural choke points. We use those. Make it so expensive to attack us that Barrett decides we're not worth the cost. Elias studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. The doubt receding, replaced by the cold calculation she'd seen when he'd defended them in the canyon. All right, he said. Let's make this valley a nightmare to assault. Over the next week, they worked on defenses whenever the weather allowed. Elias showed Lydia how to set traps in the snow, deadfalls disguised as solid ground, tripwires that would trigger avalanches on the slopes above the approaches, markers that looked natural but indicated safe paths only they knew. Each trap was simple but effective, designed to kill or maim anyone who didn't know the valley's secrets. Margaret helped sometimes, proving herself surprisingly capable for 13. She had her father's practical mind and her mother's steady hands. When Elias showed her how to construct a snare, she understood the principle immediately and suggested improvements he hadn't considered. "You're good at this," Elias told her one afternoon as she helped him set a wire across a narrow passage. "Your father teach you?" "Some. He was a carpenter. Said you had to think 3 steps ahead or the work would punish you." Her voice was steady, but Lydia saw the pain that crossed her face at the mention of her father. "Guess that applies to more than just building." "It does." Elias tested the wire tension, making minute adjustments. "You're thinking about staying up here, aren't you, after winter ends?" It wasn't really a question. Margaret glanced toward the cabin where Thomas was helping Lydia prepare dinner, his small hands carefully peeling potatoes under her supervision. "Don't have anywhere else to go. We were heading to the capital because Papa had work lined up there. But that's gone now. Our house in Red Hollow got sold for debts after we left." She was quiet for a moment, her breath misting in the cold air. "Thomas needs stability, needs to feel safe. Can't give him that if we're wandering." "This isn't exactly stable," Elias said. "No, but it's honest." Margaret met his eyes, and Lydia saw a maturity there that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "No one here is pretending to be something they're not. That counts for more than you'd think." Lydia, listening from nearby where she was marking another safe path with stones arranged in a pattern only they would recognize, felt something tighten in her chest. These children had lost everything, just like she had. But where she'd had the luxury of anger and revenge fantasies, they only had survival and each other. The work continued. They reinforced the cabin's shutters with extra bars. They moved the most critical supplies into the root cellar, where they'd be protected even if the main structure burned. They created multiple escape routes and rehearsed them until even Thomas could navigate them in darkness. And through it all, the mountains watched with indifferent patience. That night, after another meager dinner stretched to feed 5, Margaret asked a question that had clearly been building for days. "Why does Mr. Crow want you dead so badly?" The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas looked up from the piece of wood he'd been carving with a small knife Elias had given him. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Lydia and Elias exchanged glances. They'd been avoiding this conversation, but the girl deserved truth. She'd earned it with her mother's blood and her father's broken body at the bottom of that slope. "Because we have something he wants," Lydia said carefully. "My father and Elias discovered copper deposits worth a fortune. My father died before he could file all the proper claims. Barrett thinks if I'm gone, he can seize everything." "And the guide who led us up here?" Margaret's voice was controlled, but her hands gripped the edge of the table. "Probably figured he could earn a bonus by reporting our location," Elias said, "or by making the mountains look so dangerous that territorial authorities wouldn't bother investigating when we turned up dead come spring. Your family was just convenient. A way to test the routes, see how far he could push into the high country before winter closed everything down." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's knuckles went white. Thomas, who'd been quiet throughout dinner, spoke up in a small voice that cut through the tension like a blade. "Are we going to die?" The bluntness of it hit hard. Lydia wanted to reassure him, to promise everything would be fine, to wrap him in the comfortable lies adults tell children. But she'd learned that empty promises were worse than hard truths. They were the foundation of the world that had failed these children, the world that had sold her on an auction block. "Not if we're smart and careful and work together," she said, choosing her words with care. "But I won't lie to you. It's going to be dangerous, and we might have to fight." "I can fight." Thomas's jaw set with determination that looked too old for his 8-year-old face. "I'm not big, but I'm fast. Papa said so. Said I could outrun anyone in Red Hollow." "No one's asking you to fight," Elias said firmly. "You and your sister stay in the cabin if trouble comes. Let the adults handle it." Margaret snorted, a sound of pure derision. "Because that worked so well for Mama and Papa." The words landed like a slap. Elias's expression hardened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. The girl was right. Adults hadn't protected them. Her father had trusted a guide who worked for Barrett Crow. Her mother had followed that guide into the mountains believing in the basic decency of human beings. Safety had been an illusion all along, and these children had paid the price for their parents' trust. Then we all learn to handle ourselves, Lydia said, making the decision in the moment. Tomorrow, I'll teach you what Elias taught me, starting with how to shoot. Margaret nodded once, sharp and decisive. Thomas looked terrified and determined in equal measure, his small face a war between childhood fear and forced maturity. And Elias said nothing, which was agreement enough. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, lonely and hungry, searching for prey in a landscape that offered little mercy. The sound made Thomas flinch, but he didn't cry. Lydia noticed he hadn't cried since the day they'd buried his mother. She wondered if that was strength or damage, and suspected it was both. Later, after the children had climbed to the loft and their breathing had evened into sleep, Elias spoke quietly. "You sure about this? Teaching them to use weapons? You have a better idea?" Lydia was cleaning the revolver he'd given her. The motion's automatic now after weeks of practice. "No, but there's a difference between knowing how to survive and having to kill." He stared into the fire. "Once you cross that line, you don't come back. I didn't. Your father didn't. Now we're pushing children across it. Barrett pushed them first. We're just making sure they can push back." Elias didn't respond to that. He couldn't, because she was right, and they both knew it. The moral high ground was a luxury for people who weren't fighting for their lives, and they'd left that territory far behind. The next day brought clear skies and bitter cold, perfect conditions for target practice. Elias set up the makeshift range while Lydia worked with Margaret on basic firearms handling. The girl learned quickly, her carpenter's daughter precision translating well to weapon mechanics. She understood leverage and balance instinctively, knew how to compensate for weight and recoil. Like this? Margaret held the rifle the way Lydia had shown her, stock tight against her shoulder, cheek pressed to the wood. Exactly like that. Now breathe. Let half of it out. Hold. Squeeze the trigger like you're surprising yourself. The shot cracked across the valley. The bullet punched through the target 2 inches left of center. Not perfect, but respectable for a first attempt. "Again," Lydia said. Margaret reloaded and fired. This one hit closer to center. The third shot was even better. Thomas was too small for the rifles, his arms barely long enough to support the weight. But Elias found an old pocket pistol, small caliber, manageable recoil, the kind of weapon designed for close quarters defense. The boy could barely lift it with 2 hands, but he tried with fierce concentration that reminded Lydia painfully of her own father. "Aim for center mass," Lydia instructed, repeating what Elias had taught her. "Don't try for headshots, just stop the threat." Stop the threat. Such clean language for such ugly reality. But that was how you survived, by turning violence into mechanics, by reducing killing to a series of steps that could be practiced and perfected. Margaret's first shot had gone wide. Her second clipped the target's edge. By her 10th, she was hitting center mass more often than not. She didn't smile or celebrate, just reloaded and kept shooting with grim determination, her young face set in lines that spoke of purposes beyond her years. Thomas struggled more. His shots went everywhere, and after the 5th miss, tears of frustration started to leak down his cheeks. "I can't do it," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm too small." Elias knelt beside him, his movements careful despite the cold. "You are small. But that's not a weakness. It's an advantage. Small means fast. Small means you can hide in places big people can't." He adjusted Thomas's grip. "You're not trying to be a soldier. You're trying to survive, different goals, different methods. But if someone comes for you, you run, you hide. You do whatever it takes to stay alive. The gun is just insurance. One shot at close range if you have absolutely no other choice." Elias met the boy's eyes. "Your job isn't to fight. It's to survive so your sister doesn't lose you too. Understand?" Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes roughly. They were halfway through the session when Elias, who'd been watching the approaches with the vigilance of a man who'd learned paranoia was the price of survival, suddenly went still. "Everyone back to the cabin. Now!" His tone left no room for questions. Lydia grabbed Thomas while Margaret snatched up the weapons with practiced efficiency. They ran for the cabin, snow crunching under their boots, breath steaming in the freezing air. "What is it?" Lydia asked once they were inside, bars secured across the door. Smoke signal, East Ridge. Elias was already loading weapons, moving with practiced speed despite his injured shoulder. Someone's out there, and they're signaling to someone else. How many? Can't tell, but coordinated signals mean multiple groups. They're planning something. He moved to the window, scanning the tree line. This is reconnaissance. They're mapping our defenses, looking for weaknesses. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees despite the fire burning steadily in the hearth. This was it. The attack they'd been preparing for, the inevitable violence that had been building since the moment Elias had challenged Barrett in that Red Hollow saloon. What do we do? Margaret's voice was steady, but Lydia could see her hand shaking as she checked her rifle. We defend. Elias handed Lydia a rifle, gave Margaret another, positioned Thomas with the small pistol, even though they all knew the boy wouldn't be able to use it effectively. Margaret, you're on the west window. Lydia, take the east. I'll cover the door and the north approach. Thomas, you stay low behind the stone hearth. It'll stop bullets. And if anyone gets past us, you run for the root cellar and bar it from inside. Understand? Thomas nodded, eyes huge in his small face. He looked terrified but resolute, a child trying desperately to be brave in a situation that would have broken most adults. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target and no other choice, Elias continued, his voice taking on the flat, tactical tone of someone who'd done this before, who'd directed fire and coordinated defenses in situations where one mistake meant death. Ammunition's limited. Make every shot count. And remember, they're people, same as us. They bleed, they feel pain, they can be stopped. He was trying to make it easier, Lydia realized, trying to reduce the enemy to targets, to obstacles that could be overcome with proper application of force. But she could see in Margaret's face that the girl understood the truth. They were preparing to kill people. Real people with families and histories and reasons for being here that probably made sense to them. But understanding didn't change necessity. They took their positions. Lydia's hands were steadier than she expected as she braced the rifle against the window frame, checking her sight lines, memorizing the distances to various landmarks. She'd practiced this scenario a dozen times in her head, but theory and reality were proving to be very different things. The weight of the rifle felt different now. The cold air seemed sharper. Every sound was magnified. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun tracked across the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. Nothing moved in the valley except wind-blown powder and the occasional bird. Could be a false alarm, Margaret whispered from her position at the west window. Could be. But Elias didn't lower his weapon, didn't relax his vigilance for even a moment. Or they're waiting for darkness, harder to shoot what you can't see. More time crawled past. Thomas shifted behind the hearth, uncomfortable and scared. Lydia's arms started to ache from holding the rifle ready, but she didn't lower it. Couldn't. The moment she relaxed might be the moment they attacked. The waiting was almost worse than action would have been. The attack came at dusk, in that uncertain time when light and shadow blurred together and distances became treacherous to judge. Not a frontal assault. Elias had made that too costly with his traps and prepared positions. Instead, fire. Flaming arrows arcing through the twilight like falling stars, landing on the stable roof where the horses whinnied in panic. The dry wood caught immediately despite the snow covering it, flames spreading with hungry efficiency. The horses! Lydia started to move, but Elias grabbed her arm with bruising force. That's what they want. You go out there, you're dead. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead, calculating odds and options with the cold precision of a man who'd learned to see through fear to the tactics beneath. Margaret, keep watch. Lydia, with me. We save the horses, but we don't give them clean shots. They couldn't save the stable. It was already engulfed, flames reaching toward the darkening sky like grasping fingers. But they could save the horses. Elias kicked open the door and ran through smoke and flames, moving low and fast, cutting the animals loose and driving them toward the cabin with shouts and slaps. The gelding and mare bolted into the open, terrified but alive, their eyes rolling white with panic. Gunfire cracked from the tree line. Bullets punched into the snow around Elias as he sprinted back, kicking up small explosions of white. One round caught him high on the left shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. He went down hard, rolling, trying to get up. Lydia fired without thinking, 3 quick shots toward the muzzle flash she'd seen in the trees. She didn't know if she hit anything, but the firing stopped for a moment, long enough. She ran to Elias, grabbing his good arm and hauling him toward the cabin. He was heavy, dead weight, his boots dragging trails through the snow. But adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. Strength born of desperation and refusal to let this man die. They made it inside. Margaret slammed the door and barred it with shaking hands. How bad? Lydia was already tearing away Elias's coat, looking for the wound. Blood soaked through his shirt, dark and spreading. Through and through, high shoulder. His face was pale, sweat beading despite the cold, but his voice was steady. Years of controlling pain, of functioning through injury. Miss the bone, miss the artery, I'll live. The wound was ugly. Entry and exit holes, tissue damage, blood that wouldn't stop flowing. But he was right about the bone and artery. Lydia packed it with cloth torn from her spare dress, binding it tight while Elias gritted his teeth against the pain, but didn't make a sound. She'd seen him take worse, she realized. This was just another injury in a long line of damage his body had absorbed. They're moving, Margaret called from the window, her voice higher than normal but controlled. I count 4, maybe 5. Coming from the north. Let them come. Elias struggled to sit up, reaching for his rifle with his good arm. The wounded shoulder hung useless, but he adapted instantly, bracing the weapon against his knee. They have to cross open ground. We've got clear firing lanes. Make them pay for every foot. The attackers tried. 2 men broke from cover, running low and fast toward the cabin, using the smoke from the burning stable as concealment. Margaret fired first, her shot going wide in her nervousness. Lydia's second shot caught one man in the leg, dropping him with a scream that carried across the snow. Elias's shot hit the other center mass. The man went down and didn't move, didn't even twitch, dead before he hit the ground. The wounded man crawled back toward the trees, screaming for help, leaving a trail of blood like accusation across the white snow. His companions pulled him into cover, their shouts carrying across the valley. Silence fell again, broken only by heavy breathing and the crackle of the burning stable and the wounded man's distant sobbing. They're going to try again, Elias said, his voice tight with pain. This was just a probe, testing our defenses, seeing how we respond. How many do you think there are total? Lydia was reloading, her hands moving automatically through the motions Elias had drilled into her until they became muscle memory. Hard to say. But Barrett wouldn't send fewer than a dozen for a job like this. Maybe 20. He winced as he shifted position, fresh blood seeping through the bandage. They'll wait for full dark, then try to rush us. Overwhelming force, standard tactics when you have the numbers. Can we hold? Depends on how committed they are, and how much ammunition we're willing to spend. He checked his rifle, ensuring the mechanism was clear. We've got maybe 200 rounds total. If they're willing to take casualties, they can overrun us through sheer numbers. Mathematics of violence. Thomas was curled in the corner, hands over his ears, trying to block out the sounds of battle and death. Margaret stood at her window, rifle ready, looking far too much like a soldier for someone barely into her teens. The firelight cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look older, harder. There has to be another option, Lydia said. There is. Elias met her eyes, and she saw the calculation there. The cold assessment of a man who'd spent years learning how to kill efficiently. We make them think it's not worth the cost. Break their will before they break our defenses. How? He was quiet for a moment, calculating odds and options. Then, fire. It's what they used against us. We use it against them, plus the explosives. Create chaos, make them think we're stronger than we are. He explained quickly, his words coming faster as the plan formed. The explosives he'd cached around the valley. Not many, but enough if used strategically. The oil stores in the cabin basement that he'd brought up for lamps, but could be weaponized. The way sound echoed off the valley walls, making small explosions seem much larger, creating the illusion of greater firepower. We make them think we've got enough resources to hold out indefinitely, he said. Make every shot count, every explosion precisely timed. Create the illusion that we're a fortress instead of 4 people and 2 children barely holding on. It was a gamble, a desperate bluff backed by limited resources and the hope that their attackers valued their lives more than Barrett's money. But gambling was all they had left. Over the next hour, As darkness settled over the valley like a blanket, they prepared. Elias, despite his wound, directed operations like a general planning a decisive battle. His military training showed through, the way he thought about fields of fire and overlapping coverage and psychological impact. Lydia and Margaret hauled the oil from the basement, dividing it into bottles with cloth fuses, creating improvised incendiaries. Thomas, given a task to keep him from panic, arranged the bottles in easy reach at each firing position, his small hands working with careful precision. "They'll come from multiple directions," Elias said, studying the valley through the window gaps. "Try to divide our attention, force us to choose what to defend. When they move, light the bottles and throw them at the approaches. Create walls of fire. Force them into kill zones where we've got clear shots." "And the explosives?" Margaret asked. "I'll handle those. There's a trigger line running to the north cache. When enough of them cross it, I'll detonate. Should take out anyone in a 30-foot radius." He said it matter-of-factly, like discussing the weather instead of mass killing. The casual way he discussed death made Lydia's stomach turn. But this was survival now. Morality was a luxury for people who weren't fighting for their lives, for people who had time to consider right and wrong instead of just living and dying. The attack came 2 hours after sunset. Shadows moved at the edges of firelight, at least a dozen men, maybe more, hard to count in the darkness. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, exactly as Elias had predicted. Professional, coordinated, the kind of assault that spoke of military training and expensive hiring. Barrett had sent his best. "Light them up," Elias commanded. Lydia lit the first bottle, the cloth catching immediately, and threw it toward the eastern approach with all her strength. It shattered beautifully, flames spreading across the snow in a wall of fire that burned despite the cold. Margaret's bottle followed toward the west, her throw strong and accurate. The attackers scattered, their assault broken before it truly began, men shouting in confusion and pain. Then Elias triggered the north cache. The explosion was massive, far bigger than Lydia expected, the sound like the world splitting open. Snow and rock and fire erupted into the night sky, the shockwave rattling the cabin windows and shaking dust from the rafters. Screaming followed, high and terrible, the sounds of men dying in ways they hadn't imagined when they had accepted Barrett's money. When the smoke cleared, at least 4 men lay still in the snow, their bodies twisted and broken. The others had pulled back, their formation shattered, their confidence destroyed by the unexpected resistance. "Reload," Elias said calmly, like he was commenting on the weather. "They'll try again. They're committed now. Can't go back to Barrett empty-handed." But they didn't. Not immediately. Instead, a voice called out from the darkness, rough with anger and pain. "Varn, we can talk about this." Elias didn't respond immediately, just kept his rifle trained on the sound, waiting. Crow doesn't want bloodshed, just wants what's his. "Nothing up here is his," Elias called back, his voice carrying across the snow with absolute certainty. "Tell him that. Tell him he killed for nothing." "Can't do that. Got our orders." A pause, and Lydia heard desperation creeping into the voice. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. This ends one way." "Does it?" Elias's voice carried a hint of dark amusement. "Because from where I'm standing, you're the ones bleeding. You're the ones dying in the snow. How many men are you willing to lose? Is Crow paying you enough to die for him? Enough to get blown apart in the dark?" Silence. The kind that meant the attackers were having second thoughts. Were doing their own calculations about cost and benefit. "I've got enough explosives to level this whole valley," Elias continued. It was a bluff. They'd used most of what they had, but his voice carried absolute conviction. "And I've got no problem taking all of us down rather than surrender. I've died before. War took everything that mattered. This is just borrowed time anyway. So ask yourself, is this worth it? Is Barrett Crow's copper worth dying in these mountains?" More silence. Then movement in the trees, the sound of men withdrawing, of a force reconsidering its options. "This isn't over," the voice called back, but there was less certainty in it now. "We'll be back come morning, and next time we won't be so gentle." "We'll be ready," Elias said. The sound of retreat faded into the night. But no one in the cabin relaxed. They'd won the first round, survived the opening assault, but morning would bring the second attempt, and the attackers would be angry now, would want revenge for their dead. "Did we really use all the explosives?" Margaret asked. "Most of them." Elias was pale from blood loss and pain, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold. Got maybe 2 charges left. Not enough to repeat that performance. Next time they come, we'll have to hold them with rifles and fire alone." "So what do we do when they come back?" Lydia asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it said. "We hope they don't." Elias slumped against the wall, exhaustion and injury finally catching up with him. "We hope we scared them enough that they decide to cut their losses, that they value their lives more than Barrett's money." But hope was thin currency when facing armed men who'd already committed to violence. They took turns on watch through the night. Lydia's shift came at the darkest hour, when exhaustion and fear made every shadow into a threat and every sound into approaching death. She stood at the east window, rifle ready, watching the burned ruins of the stable smolder like an accusation. Behind her, Elias slept fitfully, his breathing rough and pained. Margaret had passed out from exhaustion next to Thomas. The 2 children huddled together for warmth and comfort, their faces still holding traces of childhood despite everything they'd witnessed. 5 people in a cabin built for one, all of them bound together by circumstance and survival and the simple refusal to surrender. This wasn't how Lydia had imagined her life going. A month ago, she'd been planning to open a small school in Red Hollow, teaching children their letters, living quietly, honoring her father's memory through peaceful means. She'd had a future mapped out, safe, predictable, unremarkable. Now she was standing watch with a rifle, having killed at least 1 man, maybe more, and preparing to kill again come dawn. The transformation should have horrified her, and part of it did. But another part, the part that had emerged on the auction platform and grown stronger every day since, accepted it as necessary evolution. She'd been forced into this situation by Barrett's greed and the world's indifference, but she was choosing how to face it, with weapons ready and fire in her belly and the absolute refusal to go quietly. Dawn came gray and cold, the sky the color of old steel. With it came a single rider under a white flag made from a torn shirt tied to a rifle barrel. "Hold your fire," Elias called when Lydia reached for her rifle. "Let's hear what they have to say. Might be surrender." The rider stopped 50 yards from the cabin, maintaining careful distance. In the growing light, Lydia recognized him, one of Barrett's foremen from Red Hollow, a man named Sykes, known for being one of the few fair bosses in Crow's organization, someone who treated his workers like human beings instead of livestock. "Varn," he called, "can we talk?" "We're talking." Elias stood in the doorway, rifle held casually but ready, his wounded shoulder bound tight but still bleeding through the bandages. "Lost 5 men last night. 3 more won't make it without a doctor." Sykes' voice was flat, professional, but Lydia heard the exhaustion and anger beneath it. "That's 1/3 of my force. Crow's not paying enough for this." "Then leave." "Can't do that. Got orders. Got a contract." Sykes paused. "But we could negotiate terms. Find a way everyone walks away breathing." "What terms?" "You surrender the woman and the copper claim. We leave the children alone. You walk away with your life and whatever gold you've got stashed up here. Clean break." Elias laughed. It was a harsh sound, devoid of humor, the laugh of a man who'd seen too many negotiations built on lies. "That's not a negotiation. That's surrender dressed up in pretty words. It's survival, for all of us." Sykes gestured to the valley, to the bodies still lying in the snow, to the reality of death that surrounded them. "You can't hold out forever. Even if you kill all of us, Crow will send more. He's got unlimited resources. You don't. This ends with you dead or you surrendered. Those are the only options." "Resources don't matter much when the passes are closed," Elias said. "By the time he can send more men, it'll be spring, and we'll be gone. Or we'll have brought in territorial marshals who don't work for Barrett. Game changes in spring." "You think you can make it through winter with 5 mouths to feed?" Sykes shook his head. "I've seen your supplies, saw what you've got stored. You're looking at starvation by March, even if we don't burn you out." "We'll manage." Sykes was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost regretful. "I respect you, Varn. You're a good fighter, smart tactician. You fought well in the war. I checked your record. But this is a war you can't win. Be reasonable. Save these people's lives." "Reasonable would be Crow accepting that he lost and moving on with his life," Lydia called out, stepping into view beside Elias. "But we both know that's not going to happen. He's not a man who accepts defeat." Sykes looked at her with something like pity. Miss Mercer, your father was a good man, honest surveyor, treated his workers fair. He wouldn't want you dying for pride. My father would want me fighting for what's mine. Lydia kept her voice steady, channeling the anger into cold determination. And that's exactly what I'm doing. That copper deposit is mine by right. My inheritance, my future. Then you're condemning those children to death alongside you. It was a low blow, designed to hit where it hurt most. And it worked. Lydia felt guilt twist in her gut like a knife. Margaret and Thomas didn't ask for this, didn't deserve to be caught in this war between adults and their greed. But before she could respond, Margaret stepped up beside her, rifle held with the confidence of someone who'd learned fast and adapted faster. We're staying, the girl said firmly. This is our fight too. That guide worked for Crow. Our parents died because of him. We're not surrendering to the man who killed them. Sykes shook his head slowly. You're all fools. Brave fools, but fools nonetheless. Maybe, Elias said, but we're alive fools. Your dead men can't say the same. And the wounded ones will carry scars that remind them of this valley for the rest of their lives. Final offer, Sykes said, his voice hardening. Surrender by noon. After that, we burn you out. No more negotiations, no more mercy. He turned his horse and rode back toward the trees without waiting for a response, his back straight despite the defeat he'd just absorbed. When he was gone, Elias closed the door and leaned against it heavily. His shoulder wound had bled through the bandages during the night, the cloth soaked dark red. He looked gray with pain and exhaustion, older than his years. He's not bluffing about burning us out, he said quietly. They've got the manpower and the motivation. We hurt them bad, killed their friends, and now they want revenge. Money's just an excuse at this point. Can we hold? Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. Not indefinitely, and not without casualties on our side. He looked at the children, at Margaret standing defiant and Thomas trying to be brave. If you want to take them and try to slip away while the focus is on me, I'd understand. I could hold them here, buy you time to reach the passes. We're not leaving you, Margaret said immediately, her voice fierce. You should. I'm the one they really want. You could make it to Twin Forks, get help. We're not leaving, Thomas echoed, his voice small but determined, his hands gripping the small pistol like it was all that kept him tethered to the world. Lydia looked at Elias, at this scarred, broken man who'd saved her life and given her purpose, at the children who'd lost everything but found strange family here in this cabin at the edge of the world, at the valley outside, beautiful and deadly in equal measure, snow-covered and silent and utterly indifferent to human struggle. We fight, she said, all of us, together. That's how this ends. On our terms, not Barrett's. Elias held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, something like pride crossing his face. Then let's make sure they remember this day. Let's make the cost so high that Barrett Crow chokes on it. Let's make them understand that some things aren't for sale. They had 4 hours until noon, 4 hours to prepare for the fight that would determine whether they lived or died, whether they maintained their freedom or surrendered to a system that treated people like property. 4 hours to become something other than victims. 4 hours to choose survival over surrender. And the clock was already ticking, each second bringing them closer to violence or salvation, and no one knew which it would be. The 4 hours passed like water through cupped hands, impossible to hold, impossible to slow. They used the time as well as they could. Elias, despite his wound, positioned the last 2 explosive charges at the most likely approach points. Margaret helped Lydia prepare more fire bottles, their hands moving in sync now after days of working together. Thomas organized ammunition, counting rounds with the careful precision of someone trying to contribute however he could. No one spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said. At 11:30, Elias gathered them together one last time. If this goes bad, he said quietly, I want you to know something, all of you. He looked at each of them in turn. I came up here to hide from the world. Thought isolation was the same as peace. You proved me wrong. Sometimes the fight finds you whether you want it or not. And sometimes the people worth fighting for aren't the ones you expected. Lydia felt her throat tighten. Margaret nodded once, sharply. Thomas just stared at Elias with huge eyes. Whatever happens, Elias continued, you did nothing wrong. None of this is your fault, you hear me? Barrett Crow started this. The world that sold you, that killed your parents, that treats people like property, that's what's wrong, not you. It was the most words Lydia had heard him speak at once, and every one of them mattered. Places, he said. And remember, we're not trying to win. We're trying to survive. They moved to their positions. Lydia at the east window, Margaret at the west, Elias covering the door and north approach despite his injured shoulder. Thomas behind the stone hearth with his small pistol and instructions to run if things fell apart. Noon came with silence. The valley held its breath. Wind died. Even the distant wolves had gone quiet. The world waited. Then movement at the tree line, not the cautious advance of last night, but open approach. Sykes rode forward again, this time with 8 men flanking him, all of them armed, all of them looking grim and determined. "Varn," Sykes called. "Time's up. What's your answer?" "Same as before," Elias shouted back. "We're not surrendering." "Then you're choosing death. We're choosing to live free. There's a difference." Sykes shook his head slowly. Then he raised his hand. The attack didn't come from the front. It came from above. 2 men appeared on the cliff face behind the cabin, ropes secured, rifles aimed down. They'd spent the morning climbing into position, patient and quiet. Now they had the high ground and clear shots into the cabin through gaps in the roof. "Down!" Elias screamed. Bullets tore through the wooden shingles. One round shattered the window near Lydia's head, showering her with glass. Another punched through the table, sending maps and papers flying. They couldn't defend against attackers above and in front simultaneously. The cabin's design hadn't accounted for climbers. "The loft!" Margaret was already moving, scrambling up the ladder. "I can get an angle!" She reached the loft and positioned herself at the small window there, the one Elias had cut for ventilation. From that height, she could see the climbers. Her first shot missed. The second hit one of the men in the chest. He fell, rope swinging wildly, his body tumbling end over end before hitting the snow with a sound like a sack of grain. The other climber returned fire. His bullet caught Margaret in the arm, spinning her back from the window. She cried out, pain and shock, but grabbed her rifle again with her good hand. "I'm fine," she shouted down, though blood was already soaking through her sleeve. "Stay on the front." The frontal assault came seconds later. Sykes's men charged in 2 groups, using the distraction from above to close distance. Fire bottles flew from the cabin, creating walls of flame, but the attackers ran through them, willing to take burns for the chance to end this. Elias fired methodically, each shot calculated. 1 man down. Reload. Another down. Reload. But there were too many and his wounded shoulder was slowing him down. Lydia fired until her rifle clicked empty, then grabbed the revolver. Closer range now. She could see their faces. Young men, scared men, angry men, all of them trying to kill her. She shot the nearest one twice in the chest. He fell. The next man reached the door, shoulder slamming into it, testing the bar. The wood groaned but held. He pulled back to try again and Lydia shot him through the gap between door and frame. He collapsed on the porch. "They're flanking!" Thomas shouted, his voice high with fear. He was right. 3 men were circling to the west, trying to find another entry point. Margaret couldn't cover that angle from the loft with her injured arm. "Thomas," Elias said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "The root cellar. Now. This is what we planned." But Thomas didn't run to the cellar. Instead, he ran to the west window, standing on a chair to see out, his small pistol raised with both hands. "Thomas, no," Lydia started. The boy fired, once, twice, 3 times. The shots were wild, inaccurate, but they didn't need to hit. They just needed to make the attackers think twice about that approach, to create hesitation where there had been certainty. And it worked. The flanking men pulled back, not wanting to take fire from an unexpected direction. "Good shooting," Elias said, and meant it, but the respite was temporary. More men were coming. Lydia could see them gathering at the tree line, at least a dozen. Sykes was committing everything to this assault. "Last charges," Elias said. He triggered both remaining explosives simultaneously. The blasts weren't as large as the previous nights. These were smaller devices meant for different purposes. But positioned correctly, they created avalanches on both sides of the valley, sending tons of snow and rock cascading down the slopes. The sound was immense. The ground shook. And when the snow settled, the approach routes were buried under 15 feet of debris. The men in the open were cut off from their reinforcements. 5 attackers on the wrong side of the avalanche, separated from support, suddenly realizing they were exposed and alone. "Cease fire!" Sykes' voice carried across the valley, desperate now. "Cease fire!" The shooting stopped. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the settling snow and someone's agonized breathing. "You've made your point," Sykes shouted. "Let my men withdraw." Elias moved to the door, rifle ready but lowered. "Tell them to drop their weapons. Walk back slowly. Anyone tries something, we kill them all." A pause. Then the sound of guns hitting snow. 5 men backed away from the cabin, hands raised, moving carefully toward the avalanche barrier where their companions were already digging. Lydia watched them go, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She'd killed today. Multiple people. The weight of that would come later, she knew. Right now there was just relief that she was still breathing. "Margaret?" she called up. "Hurts like hell, but I'm not dying." The girl's voice was strained but steady. "Went clean through, I think." Elias was already climbing the ladder to check her wound. Lydia moved to Thomas, who was still standing on the chair, pistol lowered now, staring at what he'd done. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded, then shook his head, then started crying, great heaving sobs that shook his small frame. Lydia pulled him down from the chair and held him while he fell apart, this child who'd tried so hard to be brave and was now paying the price for it. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're okay. We're all okay." But they weren't. Not really. Margaret had a bullet wound. Elias's shoulder was bleeding again. The cabin was shot through, the stable destroyed, their supplies depleted. And outside, Sykes and his men were already regrouping. "They'll be back," Elias said, climbing down from the loft with Margaret. He'd bound her arm, but she was pale from blood loss. "Maybe not today, but they'll come back." "Then what do we do?" Lydia asked. Before Elias could answer, a new sound cut through the valley. Distant at first, then growing closer. Horses. Many horses. Everyone moved to the windows, weapons ready despite exhaustion. If this was reinforcements for Sykes, they were finished. But the riders that emerged from the eastern pass weren't more of Barrett's men. They were territorial marshals. 15 of them, wearing badges and federal authority, led by a weathered man in his 50s who sat his horse like he'd been born on it. The marshals positioned themselves between Sykes's men and the cabin, a wall of legal force that changed everything. The lead marshal surveyed the scene, the bodies in the snow, the destroyed stable, the cabin riddled with bullet holes. His face remained impassive. "I'm Marshal Webb," he called out. "Federal territory. Someone want to explain what the hell is happening here?" Before Sykes could respond, Elias stepped out of the cabin. "These men attacked us on orders from Barrett Crow of Red Hollow. We defended ourselves." Webb's eyes narrowed. "You Elias Varn?" "I am. We've been looking for you. Got a report 3 weeks ago about a suspicious death in Red Hollow. Jonathan Mercer. Someone finally worked up the courage to talk." He glanced at Sykes. "That someone mentioned Crow's men might try something up here. Looks like they were right." Sykes's face went pale. "We were just what? Committing assault with deadly weapons on federal land?" Webb gestured to the bodies. "Looks like murder to me. Multiple counts. We had orders. Orders don't mean much when they're illegal." Webb turned back to Elias. "You got proof of your claims? About Mercer's death and the copper deposits?" "I do. Filed claims, witness statements, geological surveys, all documented." Elias swayed slightly, exhaustion and blood loss catching up. "And we've got 2 children who can testify their family was deliberately led into the mountains to die. Guide worked for Crow." Webb processed this, his jaw working. Then he turned to his deputies. "Arrest these men, all of them, charges of assault, attempted murder, and conspiracy." He looked at Sykes. "You'll get a trial, fair one, but you're done here." The arrest happened quickly. Sykes's men didn't resist. They couldn't, not against federal authority. As they were being secured, Webb dismounted and approached the cabin. "You folks all right?" "We've been better," Lydia said. "We've got wounded, and we need medical attention. We've got a doctor 2 hours back. We'll get you there." Webb studied her face. "You're Mercer's daughter." "I am." "Your father was a good man. Deserved better than what happened." Webb's voice softened. "We'll make this right. Crow won't escape this." It was the first time since her father's death that Lydia had heard those words from someone with actual power to back them up. Something inside her loosened. Not quite hope, but close. The marshals organized quickly. They brought medical supplies, food, fresh horses. The doctor, a gruff older man who'd clearly seen worse, tended to Margaret's arm first, then Elias's shoulder. "You're lucky," he told Margaret as he stitched. "Another inch and it would have hit bone. You'd have lost use of the arm." "Doesn't feel lucky," Margaret said through gritted teeth. "Lucky's relative. You're alive. That's what counts." While the medical work continued, Webb sat with Elias and Lydia, taking statements. He wrote everything down with careful precision, building a case with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this many times before. "Crow's going to lawyer up," he said. "Men like him always do. But we've got bodies, witnesses, documented claims. He can't buy his way out of this one." "You don't know Barrett," Lydia said quietly. "He owns half the territory. He owns half of Red Hollow and the surrounding counties. But I work for the federal government, different chain of command." Webb's expression hardened. "And I don't take kindly to rich men thinking they can murder their way to more wealth." Over the next few hours, the full story emerged. One of Sykes's wounded men facing murder charges and looking at a hanging decided cooperation was better than loyalty. He confirmed everything: Barrett's role in Jonathan Mercer's death, the fabricated debt, the plan to seize the copper deposits through Lydia, even the guide who'd led Thomas's family to their deaths. It was comprehensive, damning, the kind of evidence that would hold up even in a corrupt court. "What happens now?" Elias asked. "Now we take you all to Twin Forks, get proper medical care, file official reports. Then we ride to Red Hollow and arrest Barrett Crow." Webb smiled grimly. "Man's about to learn that some laws still have teeth." The journey to Twin Forks took 3 days. The marshals cleared the avalanche debris enough to get horses through, then moved carefully down the mountain with their prisoners and witnesses. Margaret rode despite her injury, refusing to be carried. Thomas stayed close to his sister, still quiet, still processing everything he'd seen and done. Elias was weak from blood loss, but stable. He rode beside Lydia, and they didn't talk much. There wasn't need. They'd survived something together that created its own language. Twin Forks was larger than Red Hollow, a real town with actual law and order. The marshals secured rooms at a boarding house and posted guards, not trusting that Barrett wouldn't try something desperate. The doctor there, a younger woman who'd trained in San Francisco, examined everyone thoroughly. Margaret's wound was healing clean. Elias's shoulder would recover fully given time. Even Thomas, who showed no physical injuries, got attention for the trauma he'd absorbed. "Children are resilient," the doctor said to Lydia privately. "But he'll need stability, routine, safety, all the things you can't guarantee while running for your lives." "We're not running anymore," Lydia said, and she meant it. The trial happened fast by frontier standards. 2 weeks after they arrived in Twin Forks, Barrett Crow stood before a federal judge, flanked by expensive lawyers who discovered quickly that money couldn't buy everything. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony devastating. Even some of Red Hollow's residents, freed from Barrett's immediate influence, came forward with stories of intimidation and corruption. Lydia testified about the auction, about her father's suspicious death, about the night Barrett had tried to claim her as property. Her voice never wavered. She'd spent too long being afraid. Margaret testified about her family's death, about the guide's confession before he disappeared into the mountains. Her youth made the testimony even more powerful, and Elias laid out the conspiracy in mechanical detail: the copper deposits, the claims, the systematic attempt to seize everything through murder and manipulation. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes, guilty on all counts. Barrett Crow was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. His assets were seized, his empire dismantled. The men who'd worked for him either faced charges themselves or scattered, looking for new employers who weren't headed to prison. Red Hollow began the slow process of remembering what it meant to live without fear. When it was over, when the judge's gavel had fallen and Barrett had been led away in chains, Lydia stood on the courthouse steps and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness, that would come later maybe, but peace. The absence of immediate threat, of constant vigilance, of wondering if today would be the day everything fell apart. Elias found her there, his arm in a sling but healing. "What now?" he asked. Lydia looked out at Twin Forks, at this town that represented civilization and law and all the structures she'd thought had failed her. Maybe they hadn't failed. Maybe they just needed people willing to fight for them. Now we file the proper claims, she said. Develop the copper deposits legally. Build something that lasts. And the children? Margaret and Thomas were staying at the boarding house, under care of a widow who'd taken them in temporarily. They needed more than temporary. They needed family. They stay with us, Lydia said. It wasn't really a question. If they want to. We're not their parents, can't replace what they lost, but we can give them a home. Elias nodded slowly. Never thought I'd be raising children. Never thought I'd be mining copper or shooting people. Life's full of surprises. He almost smiled at that. Fair point. They returned to the mountains in spring, but not to hide. This time they brought engineers, workers, proper equipment. The copper deposit was everything Jonathan Mercer and Elias had believed it to be. Rich, extensive, enough to make them wealthy beyond anything Lydia had imagined. But wealth turned out to be less important than she'd expected. What mattered was watching Margaret learn surveying, her natural talent flowering under Elias's patient instruction. What mattered was Thomas slowly returning to childhood, his nightmares fading as safety became real instead of temporary. What mattered was building something that honored her father's memory, not through revenge, but through creation. The valley changed. A small settlement grew around the mining operations. Houses, a store, eventually a school where Lydia finally got to teach. People came looking for work and found community instead. It wasn't perfect. There were disputes, accidents, setbacks. But it was honest. Elias never fully left his isolation behind. He still spent days alone in the high country, mapping and exploring. But he always came back. The war's ghost still haunted him, but they'd learned to coexist. Healing, Lydia realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding ways to live with what you couldn't change. 5 years after that desperate winter, Lydia stood at the entrance to the valley on a clear summer morning. The settlement had grown to nearly 100 people. The mine was producing steadily. Margaret, now 18, was running survey crews and making improvements to operations that even experienced engineers respected. Thomas had found peace in carpentry, building houses with the same precision his father had taught him. And Lydia herself had become something she never expected. A businesswoman, a community leader, someone people looked to for guidance. Not because she'd been sold at auction or survived a siege, but because she'd proven that it was possible to fight back against injustice and win. The copper deposits had made them wealthy, yes, but the real fortune was simpler: safety, purpose, family built from broken pieces. Elias rode up beside her, his horse a new gelding to replace the one they'd lost years ago. Thinking about the old days, he asked. Thinking about how far we've come. She looked at him. You ever regret it? Buying me at that auction? Could have stayed hidden forever. No such thing as forever. The world finds you eventually. He was quiet for a moment. Your father was right to trust me with your future. I just wish he'd lived to see what you made of it. He knows, Lydia said, and believed it. They rode into the valley together, partners in every sense that mattered. The mountains rose around them, indifferent as always, beautiful and deadly and eternal. But their indifference no longer felt threatening. It felt honest. The world was full of Barrett crows, men who saw people as property, who believed money and power could override basic human dignity. But the world was also full of people who refused to accept that, people who fought back, who built communities, who proved that survival wasn't about being the strongest or richest. It was about being the most stubborn, the most willing to endure, the most committed to the simple idea that some things, freedom, dignity, family, weren't for sale at any price. Lydia had learned that lesson on an auction block in Red Hollow. She'd reinforced it during a desperate winter in the mountains. And she'd built a life around it that honored her father's memory better than any monument could. Some stories end with revenge. This one ended with something more radical, justice, and the hard work of building something worth protecting. That night, gathered around the dinner table in the house they'd built to replace the cabin, Lydia looked at the faces of her family, Elias, scarred and steady, Margaret, brilliant and driven, Thomas, finally able to laugh without fear. Not the family she'd imagined, not the life she'd planned. Better. Because it was earned, fought for, survived. And that made all the difference.